Did you know you could abuse Azure policies? Yes, that's right. Microsoft Azure policies to have persistence, do privilege escalation, and create a lot more havoc? Yes, that's right. I have Xander Mackey from Datadog who gave this talk at Sans Cloud Next a few months ago, and this is the updated version of his talk. Now, in this talk, Xander walks through the overview of what Azure policy is, how the effect is abused, and how you can leverage these scenarios for privilege escalation. Where in the end, he also talks about how to research them as well. So Xander recorded this as part of the Advent of Cloud Security for Cloud Security podcast, so you can also find this video over there. But for now, let's get into the video and hear from Xander on how you can take advantage of Azure policy. All right, let's get into the video.
My name is Xander Mackey, and I work at Datadog as a detection engineer. And today we're going to be talking about the Azure Policy Service. This is called Who Polices Your Policies? Abusing the Azure Policy Service for persistence, privilege escalation, and other havoc. Quick agenda. So we're going to give an overview of the service. I'm going to talk about abusing something called effects. We're going to go into scenarios where you can escalate your privileges. And then I'm going to give a quick sort of secret chapter at the end about how this research came about. So if you don't want to watch the rest of the talk, this is basically it. Say beforehand, before I get into the meat of this, that I didn't really invent this technique. This is actually in the Azure threat matrix. I discovered it independently in my defense, but the threat matrix here really gives very, very sparse information about what this is. And the talk today, I hope, will give you just a deeper understanding of what this attack can do. And actually give it a lot more color than really is in this threat matrix, and some additional things that aren't really covered here. So what is the Azure Policy Service? It is a compliance mechanism built into Azure that can do compliance by detecting non-conformant resources, and it can also perform remediation. This is another more interesting way to look at it, and maybe gives you some sense of the talk to come. Okay, so I'm writing a policy in the Azure Policy Service. What are the components of that? The first thing we have is a policy definition, which is the conditions to validate it. And we also tell the service what to do if something is invalid. And then we have to do what's called a policy assignment. That's actually another object, a policy assignment, which is attaches a policy definition to a scope within Azure. And then a policy assignment may include a managed identity, which is how that policy assignment achieves permissions to do things. We'll talk about that more later. And then the final piece is something called a policy initiative, which is really a grouping of policies. That you can think of that as an example of that would be like Azure comes baked in with CIS policies as an initiative. The basic level, this is a policy definition. You have, name, description, parameters. These things can be parameterized so you can deploy them across different regions, for example, with different types of machines you could put in there. And then you get into the meat of it, which is the policy rule. And by the way, policies are defined in JSON. I'm just putting them in YAML because it's a little easier to read. So you have a condition at the top, which is checked by the policy. And if that condition fails, if it returns not true, then this effect will happen. Okay, so here's a concrete example. This is ensuring that all resources are tagged with the field department. This is a compliance. This might be important for your organization. And what this says in the effect is that if a resource that is trying to be created is not tagged with this department tag, then the resource creation is denied. Now, this is actually a crucial point to understand because the policy service sits in the loop of the policy creation, of the resource creation lifecycle. So it has a lot of hooks into the real meat of building resources in Azure. That'll come up later too. Here's kind of how these components come together. Right? We have a policy definition here, which is the logic. You assign a policy to a scope. You make it active effectively via a policy assignment. A policy assignment can have a managed identity associated with it, which is how it gets privileges. And that managed identity achieves those privileges via a role assignment, of a role. And then last piece is multiple policy definitions are called an initiative. Really, an initiative is actually only assigned once, but we'll just pretend that didn't happen. And an initiative, by the way, also can have managed identities and therefore roles associated with it. So what is it for? Right? It does what you expect. You can use it to audit resources in your environment, make sure they comply with your corporate policies, make sure they comply with ISO SOC 2. Microsoft has a lot of them built in, which is very handy. And as I mentioned before, you can also deny the resources being created in the first place. Auditing is just alerting you to the fact that they're out of compliance. Denying is actually stopping them from being built in the first place. And then you have these things, these built-in policy initiatives, which gives you things like baselines. They allow you to set compliance, via industry standard frameworks like CIS, et cetera. And you can also define custom policies if those are appropriate for your organization. But as you might have guessed from the title, there's more you can do. So here's some things you can misuse the policy service for. And one of the effects you can do is an append effect. So you can append data to the resources in question. And you can also deploy resources as a side effect of another resource not being in compliance. And you can modify resources that are not in compliance to, potentially be back in compliance, but you can do other things with that, as you can imagine. And another thing you can do that we're going to talk about at the end is escalate your privileges in a way by altering the definitions of policies. Okay, so concrete examples. We're going to append some SSH keys. We're going to mess with some ACLs. We're going to backdoor a VM, and we're going to assign some roles. Now, appending, even though it is modifying the state of a resource, actually does not require permissions, and it does not require a role. This was very strange for me to discover, and this is an odd design decision in my view, but be that as it may, appending is very powerful because of this. Okay, so here's what an append effect might look like. Here we are checking if the policy rule is acting on a virtual machine. The resource in question is a VM, and we're looking for the tags. And if the tags contains this key, so if I build a machine that has this key, what will happen is that I will add this key data down here to this field. And what that effectively means is that every VM that is created with this tag will have my SSH key as the attacker on it. And here's another one. This one takes every network security group and adds a rule to it that just opens it up. And it sets it at the top priority. So not ideal. Now, here's another kind of effect, this deploy if not exists. This is the effect that will create other resources as a side effect. What this is doing is checking, okay, this is a VM, it's a Linux VM, it has this tag, and what I'm going to do is deploy an extension. What an extension is a sort of script that runs on the VM, and as you can see here, this is executing a command, and it's calling home to my reverse shell or whatever. And what this would mean, again, would be that every VM that was spun up with this policy active would call home. Here's another one. I'm going to take all the storage accounts and modify them so that allow blob public access is set to true. Not ideal. Okay, so I talked about abusing effects. How does the privilege escalation scenario work? So we're going to talk about some of the roles and permissions necessary. We're going to talk about modifying policies, and we're going to talk about modifying initiatives. It gets a little hairy, so you have to bear with me. Okay, imagine two people. We have Alice. Alice is, an admin. She has contributor and she has user access admin. These are powerful roles. Alice can create policies, and with her user access admin permission, she can bind identities and roles to these policies, and she can assign policies. Bob is a little more dumbed down. He can do he has resource policy contributor, which basically means he can create policies, but he cannot bind them. He cannot assign roles, anything like that. Now, this is a privileged role, according to Microsoft. so keep that in mind. But this isn't necessarily something that you would think to audit, at least I wouldn't have thought at the beginning of this research. This guy's writing compliance policies. Okay, fine. What do I care? Well, it turns out that Bob can do some pretty bad stuff. So let's imagine this scenario where Alice creates a policy definition. She binds it to a role via an assignment, and she assigns a managed identity to it. Say that policy needs contributor to do whatever it does. And I've linked it to this managed identity via the assignment. What Bob can do, because he has the permissions to modify policy definitions, is actually change that policy definition under the hood. And what that means is that he can take control of the role assignment and the managed identity that's at play here. He can change this policy to do really anything he wants, and he would still be able to use that role. Okay, here's a more sticky kind of scenario. This is a modification of an initiative. Modification of an initiative. Now, keep in mind that an initiative is a set of policy definitions, and when you assign an initiative, you only assign it once, and that receives one managed identity and roles. So what you would likely do if you needed to, do things under the hood would be to attach the highest privilege role to that managed identity that it needed. In this case, the scenario is similar. Alice creates a policy initiative. She assigns it. She gets a role via a managed identity to that policy initiative. And then Bob, who's allowed to modify these things, could alter that policy initiative to add all of those bad policies we talked about before to that initiative. And he would inherit the rights of the managed identity, the privileges of the managed identity that had been assigned. Really quickly, the Azure Policy Service sounds kind of boring and anodyne. It can do compliance, it can do remediation, but there's more to it than that. If you gain the rights of resource policy contributor, again, not a role you would necessarily think to audit, you can do things like escalate privileges, and really you can do almost anything. You can think of the policy service as almost a Terraform type power, right, built into a CSM, a CSPM. So here's a secret ending. Because I want to talk about the research itself. I think that's an interesting and important thing to cover sometimes. I'm not a cloud security researcher, by title. I'm a detection engineer. But I was lucky enough to be given the opportunity to do some of this at work. We sort of had a hack week organized by Nick Frechette. I assume if you're in cloud security, you probably know who he is, but look him up if you don't. He's a colleague that I'm very lucky to work with. He organized this hack week, and I was asking him, what do I do? How do I start? I sort of thought that vuln research like this was really the domain of experts. You think you need to do all this crazy stuff. And I'm not a pen tester or a red teamer by any means. That's not my background. I come from development. And Nick really said to me, research like this starts with understanding. And so I actually spent a week reading the docs about this service, playing with it, testing it out, deploying different things. And after that week, I sort of had an inkling that I could do bad things with the service, but it took me another few months of reading more docs and playing with it to really understand that this service could be abused. And so this is kind of a call to action for you. If you have any inkling that vuln research might be something you want to try, I recommend just reading the docs, understanding a service and digging into the meat of how it works. And oftentimes that'll unlock a lot for you. So I want to thank you for listening. You're not really here, so you can't ask me questions, but leave them in the comments or send them to me via social. You can look me up. Again, my name is Xander Mackey, and it's been my pleasure. Thanks a lot for listening.